Good afternoon, and welcome to our last panel session today, entitled Namespaces, Mediating Textual and Geographical Data. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers in turn right before they begin their talks, and if you would be so kind as to reserve your questions for the end, and we can have a group discussion. Our first speaker, Anapum Basu, is Mark Steinberg Wheel Postdoctoral Fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. He is currently working on a monograph on the representation of crime and social change in early modern England. His work has been published in English Literary Renaissance and the Journal of Drama Studies, and he is currently developing a web portal that seeks to make the EBO TCP corpus tractable for large-scale computational analysis. And today his talk is entitled, A Computational Approach to Early English Orthographic Variation.
From the perspective of large-scale approaches to text mining, what's usually thought of as under the rubric of distant reading or literary informatics, orthographic uniformity is a prerequisite for analysis. In other words, most text mining and natural language processing algorithms assume a stable one-to-one mapping of orthographic forms to types. It is an assumption that, of course, breaks down spectacularly in the case of early English print, where across the corpus, orthographic and syntactical conventions constitute a set of evolving conventions. It is not surprising, therefore, that most computational approaches to text from the EBO TCP corpus have only considered orthographic variation as an irritating hindrance to be overcome, at least partially using tools like Morphodonor, which is developed at Northeastern University, and also notably VARD, developed at the Lancaster University. And one of the problems with the EBO corpus, and I'm assuming we are in general familiar with the EBO database, and when I refer to the corpus, I'm talking about EBO TCP, which is the hand-encoded corpus of currently a subset of EBO that's being put together.
So I'm going to speak because I actually don't know the database, so a sentence would be...
Oh, okay, sorry. So this is like when you are in your like little scholarly time warp tunnel, you think everyone's, of course, working on the same thing. EBO is Early English Books Online, which is a collection of everything printed in England up to 1700. So 1473 to 1700. And I'll talk a bit more about the corpus in a second. But the EBO TCP corpus is actually a hand-encoded version of that because, of course, OCR is very hard to implement on early print, largely because of wooden types, woodcuts, etc., but also due to the very nature of the paper, which tends to seep ink a little more than later paper, etc. But what makes EBO a great scholarly resource is how faithful it is to its source material, with a few exceptions where words are illegible, etc. It's generally very accurate. But that's also what makes it very difficult to use computation on because it captures every bit of variation in the early modern quartos and folio editions, etc. So my main project is on the representation of crime in popular culture in 16th and 17th century England. And this started out as an attempt to build a named entity recognition engine for early print because due to spelling variations and the fact that practically no modern database of place names really works with places in early modern London. I had to kind of test out and struggle a bit with how you can implement something that recognizes street names and neighborhoods in early modern London. And I'm not that interested in the canonical things that survive, like Ludgate, Aldgate, etc., but really fringe kind of things. So, for example, there's supposedly a place in Southwark that's unofficially called Liftskirt Lane. It was a den of prostitution. And so to get things like that in early modern spelling, you need to deal with the orthographic variation. So one of the, and this graph that I want to start out with, this is borrowed from the 2009 article by Alistair Barron and the team at Lancaster, who are behind the VARD project. And this claims to show the percentage of variant types in early modern print. And you will notice that there is a sharp degree of standardization there. And I choose the word, I notice the idea of variant types, which seems to imply that there's a lot of tolerance that multiple forms of spelling are acceptable at any moment there, and it's gradually leading up to the standardization and emergence of modern orthographic conventions, largely after the Civil War. But what it actually shows is and if you hit 1500 or 1550, 70 to 80% of this is supposed to be variant types, but reading documents from then, it's not as confusing as this graph would seem to indicate. What it actually shows is that only 20% of words in, say, 1500s are in their current modern spelling, which is not to say that the spelling conventions in 1500 or 1550 were that tolerant. So there's a distinction that needs to be made between modernization and standardization or regularization. And they are not the same. But unfortunately, a lot of the literature on this has kind of tacitly assumed them to be, if not the same thing, but at least following a similar pattern of emergence. So linguists and historians of early modern print and the standardization of the English language notice more structure within this at times, but they tend to conflate the emergence of a grammatical standard of English, which comes to be associated variously with the triangle between London, Cambridge, and Oxford, and what generally becomes the standard English, London English, actually comes from the Midlands. And there is some debate about whether that happens due to migration from the Midlands or a core community in London that becomes influential. And this question of influence, I want to hold on to, because we'll see that it raises interesting questions about how, once an orthographic standard is kind of reached within a community, how that percolates down to the entire corpus. George Puttenham, writing in 1589, can say, for example, that the correct English that everyone should aspire to is that of London and the shires lying about London within 60 miles. So that's how specific his idea of correct English that one should aspire to is. But grammatical change takes place over long time frames. It's usually a century or more. So, for example, there have been studies of the switch from verb endings in eth, giveth, to gives, and that basically starts out somewhere in the 1520s, 30s, and goes on to well into the Civil War period, and it's a gradual decline. Also, something that has led to this model of drastic regularization being accepted is the fact that, like literary critics and historians are prone to do, we tend to take written material theorizations more seriously than the actual practitioners who are printers. They're craftsmen, artisans, whereas there are philosophers of language who are debating linguistic change in this period. And some of the main figures in spelling reform are Check, Hart, Bullocker, Mulcaster, and Gill. And they're writing from the period from, say, 1570 to 1620 or so. And if you read some of the text in their title pages, you'll see that they're motivated by this desire to have an ideal form of English spelling. So with the exception of Mulcaster, who was a schoolmaster, all of their writings are trying to kind of go back to ideal forms of Latin spelling or phonetically correct spellings, and their recommendations are widely divergent from custom. And Mulcaster is the only one who says that, in the case of loan words, etc., we should adapt them to English practice. So he says of loan words that the very nature of enfranchisement doth enforce obedience to the enfranchiser's laws, not to be measured by his bare person, but by the custom, reason, and the sound of his country's speech. In other words, he's saying when we borrow words from other languages, they should be adapted to our practices. And that's partially the reason why that he doesn't see a pressing need for the standardization of spelling. He is happy to recommend that we should cut down on possible variations, but we shouldn't suddenly transform the entire English alphabet, introduce new letters, etc., to try and aspire for some sort of ideal, phonetically sound spelling practice. And contrasted to this is the practice of print, where very little attention has been paid. Until recently, nobody really thought about printing practices in the context of orthographic variation. But in a recently influential essay, Howard Hill has argued that we need to account for the actual practices in the printing presses. So, for example, typesetters had to optimize. There was a lot of incentive to speed up workflows when you're working on tight schedules. And typesetters not only had to set type, but they also had to redistribute types when something had been printed. And optimizing that is usually dependent on having a kind of reasonable background for spelling. So you read the sentence once, and you don't have to check every word and letter for possible variation. And so Howard's theory is that this coincides with the explosion of print in the 1640s, and as the volume grows, there is a scarcity of apprentices, and that forces the standardization of spelling. So the model goes that there's a lot of confusion, conflicting standards from 1473 to roughly 1620 or so. Then with the increasing number of books being printed, and you will see in a second that it really does grow exponentially. So this is number of books in EBO per year. And if you turn on the ESTC data, that's the total number we have available, and the black part is what's in the corpus. And that spike, the argument goes, is what causes the printing houses to really optimize and kind of focus on a standard. But I want to test this assumption about the drastic standardization of spelling through another approach. So what this graph shows is a set of type token ratios. What I do is I take yearly samples, so 1,000 samples each from each year of 5,000 words each. So because I want the samples to be of comparable length, which facilitates comparing type token ratios. And if there's standardization or if there's a reduction in internal variance, what you would expect is a regime of spelling that can reasonably spell the same word 3 or 4 different ways will have a higher type token ratio than a regime of spelling where that has been mapped onto only one orthographic form. But that doesn't seem to happen. Once it hits a certain level in the 1550s, it remains more or less steady. So what explains this kind of, you know, the stability of the internal coherence of linguistic variation that seems to be at odds with what you would expect from the model of the emergence of a standard in the 1620s and 30s. And here I want to talk a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused about the time, and I cannot see the. Could you just mention? 3:20. Okay. How long do I have? Okay. So I'll briefly mention the database that I'm using for this, and this is a database that we've been building at Washington University. It takes all of EBO TCD, which is about 48,000 volumes, and it breaks it down into n-gram sequences and writes it into a database. So it's a database of 22 million 1 grams, almost 70 million bigrams, and 350 million, a little over that, trigrams that's currently available. And you can search this database with regularized spelling, lemmatized searches with regular expressions and part of speeches. So you can, for example, in certain cases, so I'm very interested in the depiction of poverty and crime, and it's possible to do a search of the poor followed by a verb, etc. So in which case you don't get the adjective, but you know, the poor lie in the ditches, that sort of thing comes up. And just so I don't run out of time, I'll quickly show you this version of the graph, which is the number of tokens in the corpus versus number of texts in the corpus. You'll notice there's a slight difference in that, and that's illustrated by this graph, which basically plots the length of each text, and every time there's political upheaval, the mean length of or the median length of text drops, because people are writing more and more pamphlets in those times. But the argument is, once the volume of text shoot up in the 1630s, 40s, that leads to standardization of spelling. Now, if you plot just letter frequencies all across the corpus, you can see for certain letters there are interesting patterns, not quite clear patterns. So E gradually declines. That you could attribute that to the disuse of the trailing E. I and Y seem to indicate a really interesting switch, but it's in a different period than the one where you would expect that to happen. So can we use computation or large-scale analysis to kind of validate and test the current model of orthographic change and ask what it tells us about other literary phenomena? And if you plot love against LOUE, love, across the corpus, this is the sort of change that you see. It's really sharp. It's much tighter than the models of grammatical change, which span a century or more, and it holds for other words too. So this is above, save, move, etc., with their UE variations. So all of that variation happens quite sharply in that period, and you could still explain this, saying that this is the standard model coming into effect. Same with IJ, Jesus, Jesus, and but if you take the example of king, where the YI shift happens, it's in a distinctly different period. And once that change happens, the older form basically goes out of use. So internally, it seems to indicate a much more coherent model of change than we have generally suspected. Go do words with trailing E's are really interesting examples. It's almost as if this culture decides to switch to the trailing E for a while and thinks about it, and there's a nah, that's too much of a hassle, and rejects it. So how can we turn some of these examples into a form that's computationally tractable? How can we go from anecdotal examples of words that I can think of and kind of verify the pattern to see if I can pull out a kind of cultural model of orthographic change? And one final example, teach, the three versions of it kind of overlap with different bits of emphasis. The oldest form is T-E-C-H-E. That dies out pretty quickly. With E is replaced with EA, with a trailing E. That dominates for a while and then dies out, and then the modern spelling takes over. So, to turn this into something that's computationally tractable, what I want to do is I want to ignore the kind of lumpy bits of the graph, in the sense that someone who's actually interested in the discursive history of the word would be very interested in the general decline, etc. But for me, that's not the interesting part. I'm interested in when the word form arises, and so I'm interested in the emergence of the orthographic form. So what I do is I take something like LOVE, love, and turn it into a vector like this. So zeros, then I mark the period of rise. So it's basically taking the shape of a time series graph and figuring out where the change happens. So this is LOVE, love. LOUE, love, is just the opposite. This is GOE, go. And I'll just mention that this form of the vector is really useful in training a model and identifying words that are not standardized. And we're using it to improve the kind of spelling correction of Morphodonor at Northwestern. But you can do a little better and actually isolate just the period when that shift happens. And so this is where love, so above 0 is something is on the rise, something is declining, and in the case of go, that's the period of rise and that's the fall. If you extrapolate all of this data, so this is a sample of roughly 20,000 words, sample from the corpus that show the kind of distinctive S-curve that you would expect. This is the model of change that emerges. So this basically shows words that are coming into, just 30 seconds, okay. Words that are coming into usage in the language, so words that show a sharp rise, and most of the change happens from the 1550s to 1600, way before the kind of orthographic tracks take hold. And the final graph of standardization by 1660 doesn't quite hold because a lot more words are still dying out of the language. So hopefully this gives us a better model to think about how language change works, and it also enables, apart from better, algorithmic spelling correction, it also motivates certain literary questions like the use of archaism in certain, in Spencer's poetry, for example, because if you can build a model for language change that's limited by time, you can start to ask, are certain poets actively writing in an older style, etc. So, sorry for going over time. Thanks.
Our next two speakers, Aaron Plasek and Rob Koehler. Aaron works at the intersection of literature, media, and computation. He holds an MFA in writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and bachelor degrees from Drake University in physics, astronomy, and English writing. Aaron, just raise your hand so you can specify which one of the duo you are. Having taught literature and composition at Colorado State University, Metropolitan State University of Denver, and elsewhere, he is pursuing an MA in the Humanities and Social Thought program at NYU, where he is currently writing a history of machine reading spanning from the 17th century to the present. His co-speaker is Rob Koehler? Koehler, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Rob Koehler is a PhD candidate in English at NYU. He works at the intersections of literature, history, and education, focusing on the growth of the English language as the primary locus of education in 18th century Great Britain and America. His digital interests include text analysis, network analysis, and data and metadata development in previously under-investigated areas. And the title of their talk is Mediating Genres of Prestige, Credit, and Authority, the Epigraph and the Citation. Please welcome Aaron and Rob.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. We added the epigraph, the motto, and the citation, thinking about these genres. But I want to begin with talking about Digital Experiments, which is the group that we're representing here and why we're co-presenting. Digital Experiments at NYU was started a few years ago by graduate students and is since funded by microgrants from the English department at NYU. And since it's a group of graduate students, it's mostly guided by the interests of the members. And so we often are trying to, well, each year we try to come up with a project that will unite our several different backgrounds, our expertise, these various things together. And
And our screen is.
and our screen is crazy. We're not exactly sure what's up with that.
Here, let's do this.
Well, anyway, sorry. And so last year we started work on what we called the Epigraph Project, which was an investigation into citation, epigraphing, quotation, practices of negotiating authority in print. And this all started, to give a sense, one of our group members was Rachel Scarborough-King, who's since left NYU, but at the time she was working on The Spectator. And she was working on topic modeling with The Spectator, and she was getting this annoying result with the Latin epigraphs in The Spectator. She's like, gee, couldn't there be an easy way for us just to pull all the Latin epigraphs out so we just had the English print of all the essays? Turns out it wasn't actually, and I was going to talk about some of the technical difficulties we had about trying to work on this, but I'm going to talk and try to frame a little bit more what we're trying to do. Because we are all in English, we are all literary scholars in a way, but we have broader interests than that. So initially I want to talk about kind of the various genres we're looking at. And so you can kind of see here, starting with the motto, because when Addison puts those Latin quotes at the beginning of his essays, he calls them mottos. And in Spectator number 221, which I have a quote from up here, he explains his process. He says that after he gets done writing The Spectator, he comes back and he goes through the classical authors, in particular Horace. He loves Horace. Over a third of the Spectator papers are prefaced with a Latin quote from Horace, and thinks about what his paper's about and whether someone in the classical literature has said it better than he has. And so then he knows that once he puts that above the text, that there's at least one good line in this essay, whether or not it's his. And so the way here that the motto serves as a call to authority, to classical authority, and the motto more generally had come into English in the medieval period, and it was used, for example, in coats of arms. This is the coat of arms of English royalty. Semper Idem is the motto for the coat of arms. It's also used in emblem books in the Renaissance. And so the motto is always kind of this, in a sense, giving authority or trying to express authority for someone. And so he's continuing that tradition by attaching Latin to his essays. Another example is the epigraph. And so the epigraph perhaps is a Greek term, but it comes into use in the with the early humanists, because they come to this recognition as they look around and they find, for example, inscriptions above doors, which is really epigraph, writing above in Greek. And so they call these things that they find epigraphs. The kind of premier example to us is the Rosetta Stone, which was in a cliff face in Egypt before it was ripped out by a Napoleonic soldier and brought to Europe. But anyway, that serves as this kind of living note of history that's still surviving amongst us and has come through for them, for the humanists in particular, has come through the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. And now it serves as a source of authority. It serves as a source for classical language in a way that they're trying to get away from medieval Latin. And you also see then in the early modern period that it starts to serve, the epigraph starts to be used as a reference for the text in Puritan sermons. So for example, here in the 1623 essay or sermon, he cites and he says, the epigraph or title of my text, with the other context of some degrees. So talking about the work he's using, the Bible, as this source of authority as well. And so you can see the way it spreads. Epigraphs become more generally what we now call, at like the start of a chapter or on the title page of a novel or a group of essays, this call to either literary authority, linguistic authority, sacral authority in some ways with the epigraph. And so the ways in which, again, power is being played out here in relation to authority and calls to authority. And finally, the thing that's probably most familiar to us as scholars, the third term would be citation. And citation comes into English from French as a legal term. And so it's a call to come to court, it's a call to come to a tribunal. And so you have this great example, again from the early modern period, from Ebo, of the King Henry's irritated at someone, Lord Cobham. And so the bishop puts up a citation, his friends come and tear it down, he has to put it up again. And so the sense in which he's trying to call these people to account. And so again, there's a relation to authority here, to power here. And we can think even now the way we use citation, both as like getting a parking ticket is a citation, so you've been cited for something, but also in literary work, the way that whom we cite serves as the authority that we're trying to negotiate with, or the disciplinary structure that we're a part of, which Aaron will be talking about more as we go along here. And so the way that all of this happens in multiple domains, religious, literary, political, et cetera, et cetera. And so Aaron's actually going to talk about two of our ongoing projects that have come out of this, different ways of looking at things. One about literary epigraphs in the novel, and the other about citation in scholarly communities. So I'll leave that to him.
Cool. So that gives you sort of a historical grounding, how we're thinking about these things. Now, the rest of this talk is going to be about doing things, or probably more accurately, not doing things. So the Digital Experiments Group brings together a bunch of different stakeholders, right? So we're all graduate students, and we all have our own interests, right? So there's some PhD students, right, at different levels of their work, right? Some are applying the jobs right now. Some haven't begun the dissertation, right? There's me, right? I'm a master's student. So we all have different concerns, and we all want effectively different kinds of evidence for the work that we do. So it's really important, I think, just to point out at the start here, that I think successful collaborations in DH always at the outset constantly make explicit what kinds of evidence or what kinds of work people want to generate for each person in the group, right? There should be outcomes for each person. So if one person needs a research article, we state that out front, like this is something that I want to have after doing this, right? If one person wants a program, or one person wants to do whatever, right? It's just very clear, and there'll be different levels of engagement and different levels of time and energy people have. So this makes it really hard, actually, to do anything, because we have 4 instigators who basically set up the meetings and identify projects. And in fact, each one of us has a kind of sub-project as part of the Epigraph, and we're also on each other's projects, right? Like Rob, you're on several. And so what you get, as you probably well know, is this thing that they call, with regards to the space shuttle, mission creep, right? When they were making the space shuttle, some of you probably know this, they kept changing the sort of technical parameters of what the space shuttle was supposed to do. So they'd be in the middle of making or designing one thing, and then suddenly the parameters that they would change, and they would have to redesign the thing they made, right? So we have some of that in our group, and it's born out of the same sort of problem that the space shuttle had, right? Which were sometimes when you were trying to make a thing that no one had ever made before, or just trying to make a thing work, you find certain things you thought would work don't work at all, or work in ways that you wouldn't have expected. And so the rest of this talk will be sort of examining that. Okay, so you won't be able to read this. This is Python code. So the first thing we started with is, text, XML text, TEI XML text we downloaded from Monk. So Write American Fiction, and early American fiction online, or just early American fiction actually. And so we had all these texts, about 411 I think it is. And so all the texts, conveniently enough, have epigraph tags. So all we have to do is just pull the epigraphs that have already been encoded by a human and collect them all, and collect the attributions. Should be relatively painless. It was not. So there's several things going on here. One thing is we thought that hiring a so we work basically on micro grants. We have like maybe like $1,000 give or take every semester that we apply for every semester. And so we thought maybe we could get some programmers to help us, right, from the computer science department. And in fact, what ended up happening was we would go through iterations of the program, as is often done. But in my own perspective, I was thinking like, oh, I'll save some time, right? I'll ask some programmers to do some stuff for us and it'll be great. But in point of fact, I ended up spending way more time than I would have if I just wrote it myself. Because in fact, I would go look at the code, go through the code very carefully, find problems, and then talk to them, and then set up meetings. And so it just became like a whole new job, for which I'm not getting paid, right? No one in this group is getting paid. Like, we're paying a computer scientist now, or a computer programmer, right, to make this thing. And in fact, it's actually slowing us down rather than speeding us up. So, okay. Is there anything else I want to say about this right now? Okay, another problem is, as we ran into technical difficulties, depending on like, we wanted to use SQLite, and then we were like, oh no, we should use MySQL or MongoDB. So the number of technical issues that we sort of floated through. And each time we did this, it led to a new iteration of the code. At some point we decided, oh, we need to get all these other things. Some things like getting the attribution from epigraphs is non-trivial. It's not particularly difficult, but it took a little bit of doing. Okay. So finally we get the code. Great, it works. Yes. So that's the total number of epigraphs we got. And about basically half the novels that we got from these collections have epigraphs. And half don't. So great. Let's start doing the theoretical work we set out to do in the first place. Well, there's problems. So here's an Excel sheet that basically we open the CSV file with that we produced from pulling all these epigraphs from the text. And so James Fenimore Cooper, Wyandotte. It says there, basically it says this is one instance of an epigraph. So it's saying there's one epigraph from this text. And being the good humanists that we are, we know there's something like on the order of 33 epigraphs in that text, right? What the heck happened, right? So this is in fact what an epigraph looks like encoded in the text that we have. You actually, I don't know if you can see this, but the epigraph tag here, just TF, or just XML. Okay. So where did all our other epigraphs go for this text? If we only got one and we know there's 33, what's going on? Well, it turns out quote tags are used instead of epigraph tags for the epigraphs in this text. And you would never know this. There is no computer science check you can pull here to realize that, in fact, there's more epigraphs because it hasn't been coded, right? Because it's under a completely different tag. And unless you just know, because you know something about literature, you'll miss this. Now, the whole point of doing this with a program was to do 10,000. We wanted to get at least 10,000 epigraphs, because otherwise, why are we bothering with a computer? We can do this by hand, right? Like, people do. We were just having this conversation, right? Like, we can count stuff. Like, and for all the time and effort that we spent, like, if we can only get what we already got by hand, that's not so interesting. But problems like this are huge, because they, in fact, make you question the entire corpus you're using. Because we know about this text, but we don't know about the other texts, right? I mean, and presumably, if we're doing a humanly unreadable corpus, then by definition, we can't check these texts. So this doesn't end the game for us, but it certainly makes us question in sort of a fundamental way, like, is the data we're generating actually reflective of the corpus that we're looking at? Okay, so you might say, well, okay, why was it in fact tagged as a quote and not an epigraph? Like, can we track, go back to the origin of the corpus itself, like how the corpus is generated, and try and figure out, are there other tags that epigraphs might be under that we want to check, right? So that's the next thing we did. But it turns out that's not simple to do. And here's sort of the answer as to why it's not simple to do. So the creation of this text for this particular XML document was contracted out, right? The actual encoding of the text is contracted out. It says right there who did it, right? And so, which is a commercial entity, which you could approach and talk to. And maybe they would tell you something. But the difficulty here is that we've effectively bottomed out. This is a black box now. Like, there are interpretive decisions always being made in these kinds of encodings. And so we need to know, in some ways, right, to do this Epigraph project successfully and have confidence in the actual results we're getting are real and not artifacts of how they've been encoded. We need to know something about what decisions were made in deciding, okay, we're going to quote actually these things as quotes and this one thing as an epigraph. Well, what do you do? Okay. There's something, well, because I mean, one answer is you just give up. You just throw up your hands and you say, well, I don't know. I'm no longer comfortable making claims with electronically encoded texts. Guess I'm going to go do something else now. But we're actually not interested in that kind of line of argument. So the question is, what can we do to try to address these problems? So one thing is to externalize the corpora, the construction of the corpus, right? Because in fact, documentation practices for how the corpuses are created and how the corpora are created and where they came from are actually pretty slim. Usually these things are outsourced in the end, right? By projects that have, $1 million, and then you outsource the actual encoding of the text to someone else. That's fine, and there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. But when you come to problems like the one we encountered with epigraphs, unless you can sort of create the picture for how interpretation, like why particular interpretations were made, it's very difficult to be sure that the data you're actually getting from the corpus is accurate. So one thing would be like more extensive documentation practices, right? And this is just like scholarly editing, right? The better scholarly edition goes into more detail about various textual decisions that the editor made. So there's another problem here. In theory, we're talking about epigraphs. This is a countable thing. I mean, it's empirical. There shouldn't be any confusion about how many epigraphs there are. If you say there's X number, there should be X number. I mean, granted, there's some fuzziness about what an epigraph is. We can have a conversation about that, and that's great. But we're really talking about empirical things. So in that case, we should be able to reproduce the results that our colleagues have generated. Right? Not asking for the moon. Just saying, like, we should be able to have enough detail that we can always reproduce the results of our colleagues. And I know maybe people are thinking in their heads, of course that's true, and it is true, except I would argue it's not. It's absolutely not true at all. For instance, if I wanted to reproduce Matthew Jocker's work in microanalysis, how would I go about doing it? The first thing I would absolutely need is the corpora he used. And that's basically one argument that's just going to be like a crux of this talk. Give me your corpus, let me try it for myself, and let me see if I get the same results as you. And if that's not possible, then it's very difficult to actually do research. And so this is a huge problem. I know people want to argue that we've solved it, but we haven't. I just don't know what else to say. I think it's an outstanding problem. And so, okay, so enough about that. Last thing I just want to mention, corpora's constraint. So really, in knowing the history of your corpus, how it was generated, it effectively tells you what kinds of questions you can ask. You can't just assume that your question can be answered by the corpus you're using. But the problem is, the catch-22 is, you may not realize you can't ask the question you're answering or trying to ask until you've already spent a tremendous amount of time examining your corpus and trying to see if it's possible, right? I mean, the epigraph, for our project, it seemed very easy, right, to pull epigraphs out, right? But then suddenly you find cases where it's very different than what you expected. And then, again, it calls into question sort of everything you've done. Okay. So in some ways, I mentioned, epigraphs are empirical. We should be able to have a certain number, and we should agree what that number is for a particular set of texts, right? And we should know what that corpus is, right? I mean, if you're going to give me an argument about novels in the 18th century, then you better damn well tell me what text you're using, right? Frequently, this isn't done. So anyway, epigraphs seem pretty well defined, but there could be some interpretive questions, right? I mean, there could be places where we really don't know whether to call that an epigraph or not. That absolutely could happen. And so, for me, this leads to a question of how do algorithms highlight methodological assumptions of a discipline, as well as impose assumptions on that discipline, right? If we want to track an abstract concept like epigraphs, does the way in which we try to, instantiate these things affect the kinds of things we can ask? Okay. So, thinking about abstraction, I began to wonder, is there a way that we can use citation to talk about more abstract things? So citation seems like an empirical thing. I should be able to count that. Can I then use citation to look at things like disciplines? Right? So we're making a little move here. So we're moving, actually, we were just talking about 18th century novels. Now we're moving to 20th and 21st century journal articles. Citations are countable. Can you use, for instance, if I take I just want to write in the chalkboard because it seems wonderful. If I take a seed article, some article, John Guillory's Memo Modernity is the article I'm going to point to in a bit. I can say, here's all the citations that this article references, right, in the past. Here's all the citations. Here's all the articles that cite this article in the future, right? This is time, I guess. This is one citation network. I can maybe go out several nodes. I can generate a whole bunch of citation networks for a whole bunch of different articles. Right? So I have another citation network for this other seed article. Maybe they intersect there. Right? These are articles in the past. Some article in the future cites both of these. Right? And so you can construct webs of citation by looking at individual citation networks around articles. How much time do I have?
We're done.
You're about up.
I'm about done. Okay, so I'm just going to say this really briefly. So the idea was then, can you in fact identify disciplines merely by citation, treating effectively the journal article as the unit of analysis? And the answer is, we have these hypotheses, but similar to the Epigraph project, there are algorithmic assumptions that are not clear to us. And so it in fact makes things like getting citation networks tricky. For instance, in John Gurley's article, this is how JSTOR in fact gives you citations, right? These giant block footnotes. So you have to pull the citations out of these block footnotes. To automate that, of course, is very tricky. There's other people that have better solutions to this problem. But again, the point is, even constructing something is relatively straightforward, as these citation networks turns out to be very tricky, and turns out to require us to know things about algorithms we simply don't have access to. So it's a plea, in fact, for explicating your algorithms, because algorithmic capacity, when you're using an algorithm to make an interpretation, algorithmic capacity is methodological capacity. Now we're over time. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm pleased to introduce our last speaker, Ben Schmidt. Benjamin Schmidt is an assistant professor of history at Northeastern University and core faculty at the New Lab for Texts, Maps, and Networks. His research interests are in the digital humanities and the intellectual and cultural history of the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. His digital humanities research focuses on adapting techniques from data visualization and machine learning to enable the critical analysis of historical data. His dissertation, entitled Paying Attention, described how shifting ways of measuring and defining attention in pedagogy, advertising, and psychology transformed American understandings of the subject from 1890 to 1960. He also uses data from time to time to write less formally about the relatively unrelated topics of higher education in the United States and accuracy in historical fiction. Please welcome Ben.
I don't know why I felt the need to put relatively unrelated in front of those two topics when I wrote that last week. Where did the dongle for this go? There. Oh. So I'm going to plug this in, and then I will speak while fiddling. This worked before. Yeah, what is my, it doesn't, so neither of these is my view. Oh, okay, laptop.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, that looks like something, yeah. So that is my display. See. Sorry, I always say when I go through one of these periods that it is a major methodological hazard of being in the digital humanities, that people are even less forgiving when you're unable to handle your technology. So. Yes, this should work. All right, I'm trying out a very new and exciting slide deck, so I'm inflicting this all on you. All right. So what I want to talk about today is not what I usually talk about in settings like this, which is my own sort of personal research agenda, but instead to talk about something much more infrastructural, to do what I think of in the digital humanities, the genre of the tool talk, in which I talk about a particular project that I've been working on. And it is something that I'm always reluctant to do, that I've only done a few times, because it is certainly not at the heart of my job as a history professor to do this. But one of my core convictions about digital humanities, and one of the reasons that I got into this field in the beginning, is that I think that it offers right now a very interesting set of possibilities and matters in large part because it is a site through which humanities scholars have more ability to shape the research infrastructure in which we work, and through which the general public accesses the sources and the documents which we care about, which is why we got into this business to begin with. And I'm going to talk about this particularly in the domain of how we can share large textual collections for what's called, sort of infelicitously, non-consumptive research. First, just some acknowledgments about what this project is. This is, like a lot of tool projects, a sort of collaborative work. Erez Lieberman-Aden at the Rice Cultural Observatory and the Baylor College of Medicine co-directs the Bookworm project with me. All of these people here have made substantial contributions. There are other people not listed here who have made other contributions as well. And we've gotten funding from various people in the past. I'll talk about the NEH grant, which just spun up and which is interesting for this in a little bit. But in the past, the Digital Public Library of America sort of kept this going through last year. So this is the project. And it is more than just a tool, it's a platform for the analysis of large textual collections. This is a screenshot of the sort of most polished and largest front end that we have and the largest database that we've built it on, which is a collection of texts from the Open Library or text from the Internet Archive with metadata from the Open Library. And like any platform, this is something that offers a distinct set of values for different groups. There are sort of three pillars for who it is that we want to use Bookworm. First, for general users, this provides a better way to explore text data through visualization than what is already out there. For researchers, this is something that gives an open API that can return a variety of very useful textual data for research and easily integrate a large number of methods while getting around some of the most pressing issues with copyright. And then finally, for anyone who has a large textual collection, this provides a way for them to share it, for them to make it accessible in new ways to both the public and to the researchers who might want to use it. And the basic idea behind this is this platform that works very well with large collections of text with metadata, up to 10 or 15 million documents with hundreds of thousand words in each of them. There are not that many textual collections out there, particularly not of interest to humanists, that are any bigger than that. I'm going to talk about this in three steps. First, I want to give a concrete overview of what we have now and who it's useful for and who is building on this. Second, I want to talk a little bit more abstractly about what I'm calling in this talk a grammar of text analysis, which is the sort of thorniest set of problems that's confronting us right now. And then finally, I'm going to pull back into being slightly more concrete again and tell you how that grammar is useful and how that enables useful combinations of various different types of textual metadata that solve a lot of problems that humanists are working with, that talk to a lot of the issues that people have been talking about today. So on the practical side, there is a need in work, not just in the digital humanities, but in the humanities at large, to understand large textual collections at scale, large digital libraries. All humanists, whether they're digital or not, if there is such a thing as a digital humanist rather than digital scholarship. I know this is, sort of speaks to some of Julia's core concerns. Need to understand how to navigate these large libraries that are coming online. Scale is in many ways the defining feature of things like Redex, which has millions of newspaper articles, JSTOR with hundreds of thousands of journal articles. Google probably has about 20 million books. And we don't know, for the most part, what sort of stuff is in there, or not as well as we should. There's sort of two ways that people talk about digital humanities, two sort of core forms of rhetoric that they mobilize. Some people say there are all these amazing opportunities out there and we need to figure out how to leverage them. Some people say we are failing dramatically and you need to be more anxious than you are. And I tend rhetorically to fall on the anxiety side of the spectrum. I don't know what that says about me. But we do need to be anxious. But there are also opportunities. One of the things that you notice if you look at a lot of research programs looking at digital text, particularly coming from historians, is that they look now primarily at metadata. For example, the Bill Lane Center for the American West visualizes the spread of newspapers across the United States, but does it not with anything about the internal textual composition of those newspapers, just does it through a map of the publication locations of those newspapers themselves. The Stanford Republic of Letters project is mapping the correspondence networks of various Enlightenment philosophers. Again, this is not something that's looking at the text that they're exchanging. It's just simply looking at whose names are on the letters and where they are going to. Finally, this is maybe the most widespread text visualization. It's a very nice one from the Old Bailey Online, a data mining with criminal intent grant through the NEH that looks at how expanding this divergence in the length of trials in the late 19th century, which shows the rise of the plea bargain. It's an observation that you can make looking at trials in the Old Bailey Court in London without worrying about the internal textual value of them. In English departments, rather than history departments, the state is somewhat different, but there too I think there's been a trend towards using aggregate tags to look at large textual collection, using things like sentiment analysis, topic modeling, and named entity recognition. And one of the things that I'm going to say is that, in fact, these are strategies that are best thought of not as entirely new creatures upon the earth, but rather as a simply new way of creating machine-created metadata rather than working with hand-created metadata. And it's something that can be linked into existing strategies for working with metadata and with understanding the external parts of books. This focus, I think, on metadata is very good. An example from my actual research project, rather than my infrastructural project here, which looks at a different sort of texts, is metadata from climatological logs from books of the paths of ships in the 19th century and the 20th century in the United States. And just by taking out the locations that ships are in, you manage to get a very sort of comprehensive picture of the constraints under which ships operate, right? You see the emergence of the globe here. The globe is not, this is not a map. This is just a plotting of XY coordinates in a larger data set. And if you did not know that there were continents in advance, this is sort of the ultimate answer to what does this tell us that it didn't do before. If you didn't know there were continents, now you know there are continents that constrain the movement of ships. But what I actually want to argue is that metadata is much richer than that because it shows not just constraints under which you operate, but also very sort of fundamental things about the way that you use the world. This is a set of 19th century sailing logs that the US government used to measure wind patterns. When the Soviet Union goes out and tries to do the same thing, it doesn't take these sort of nice sinuous curvilinear lines around the Pacific Ocean. Soviet Union travels in straight lines, which is even crazier when you go onto the map of the world. There is this strange sort of gridded embeddedness. This is sort of a purely Soviet way of looking at the state. I've looked through dozens of these decks. Nothing else looks remotely like this. And this is one of these places where by taking in the contours of the metadata of a large corpus, you can start to really understand something about the mindset of the world that created it that might not be otherwise visible. Let's see, let me refresh this guy for you here. Try this, there we go. Sort of last piece of this is this project here, the Google Ngram Viewer, which my let me get up over here. Which my collaborator, Erez Lieberman-Aden, created with Google back in 2010. This is the sort of tool that is useful for exploring a large collection like Google Books that tells you a lot about the way that language has changed, except for the cases when it doesn't. My favorite ngram recently is this one here that shows the long decline of thou, thee, and thy through a 200-year span, and then their sudden rise again in the year 2008. The reason for that being simply that there is one publisher, BiblioBazaar, comes into business and starts doing digital reprints of a large number. Oh, sorry, I'm confused about which slide deck I'm in here. Starts doing large numbers of reprints. It is the largest single publisher in the Google Books corpus in 2008. And people, I can sort of go on with these sorts of examples at length. One of my favorites is the 02138, the Harvard Library zip code corpus, which declines dramatically after 1922 because these things stopped showing up in books because of the agreement that Bob Darnton negotiated with Google when he finally let them into the Harvard Library, which dramatically changes the sort of books you get when you search Google. And this kind of problem often makes humanists sort of throw up their hands in despair at the possibility of working with these sorts of messy corpora. And for those people who don't use computers at all in their research, that's fine, but everybody is actually using Google Books. And the reason that I want everyone to feel anxiety is because I don't think that there is sufficient work being done that people know, for example, that the Google Books corpus is much weaker in medical literature after 1922 than it is before 1922, because the Countway Library of Medicine has a really extraordinary collection that Google didn't manage to get at. You can also figure out what libraries Google is scanned from. So the first thing that we did when we were trying to come up with a better solution than something like ngrams was to enable you to construct your own corpora. Rather than ngrams, which indexes purely at the document level, we index at the book level, which lets you do things like restrict solely to subjects in science, originally in English, restrict solely to the social sciences, and see how a particular language works. And we've built a whole bunch of these things which are out there now, some looking at science articles, some looking at books. I put one up recently that I am enjoying a great deal about movies and television. The largest one, and by some measures, is of historical newspapers. But what's actually really exciting about this project for me right now is a lot of other people are starting to adopt it for their own sources as well. The Yale University Library has made it a centerpiece of their Digital Humanities initiative, is using it to plot the full text of Vogue magazine. The Medical Heritage Library, which is a consortium of groups that Gather Medical Texts is building one on their own collections. The Office of State is using it for their historical records. That's going to be smaller than these, but it's really interesting because it's based on a TEI corpus, which is something that Julie and I have been talking about, how we can extend out to build these sorts of things on all different sorts of TEI corpora. But the biggest and most interesting one for me is the Hathi Trust, which is the largest collection of digital books outside of Mountain View, California, and all of its associated server farms, and just about as big as the Google corpus in most ways. And we just got a large implementation grant from the NEH to build one of these that will not just include the publicly available ones, which they have on their alpha collection, but also to include a lot of less easily accessible texts. That project has prompted a lot of sort of hand-wringing on my own part about what exactly it is that we want to explore, because although these line charts are fun and engaging and allow you to access text in new ways, and one of the things I should say is in all of these, unlike Google Ngrams, you can actually just click and get direct access to underlying texts. One of the things that I think it's very important for us to solve is how we can enable the largest sort of uses of textual data for not just temporal changes over time, but everything that encompasses the wide variety of metadata that is out there. The sort of core philosophy underlying this is first an infrastructural one, that we need to have libraries sharing textual data. I mean, I would actually disagree with you guys in some way. I don't think that Matt Jockers should be making his texts available. I think that the University of Nebraska Library should be making his texts available for us. Like, this is a core function.
Great. He didn't get his text from Nebraska. They were under license at Stanford.
Well, then Franco Moretti should be doing it. I'm thinking, and I mean, some of his more recent ones, it's very difficult to do. Let's do this as a Q&A issue, actually. I have lots of thoughts about this. Maybe we can just dock this time out of the Q&A. But that it is a core library function to do this sort of thing, that large text collections share all of these fundamental problems, that it's crazy to keep reinventing the wheel every time we come across a new major text collection, and that's why I'm glad that people are adopting this as a platform themselves. This is open source, it's on GitHub, anybody can just sort of pull it down. In many of these cases, I didn't know that these people were doing it until they emailed me a link to their browser. That we want to be able to share these presentation forms and improve them over time. This should be an iterative process. You don't just launch something and leave it sitting there. And that data visualization should be a primary output, not the primary output of these sorts of texts. So one of the issues that I want to support is that a single backend should be able to drive multiple sorts of representations of text. So for instance, here, this is an example from my dissertation looking at the term focusing attention over time. And what this is something that lets you put in any given term, and instead of looking at it as a line chart over time, look at it instead as, you know, a bar chart, so you can see the ways that different genres are using a particular piece of language over time. And as I said, click through, and at any point that you want to, go and read the individual underlying texts. The search engine doesn't always work particularly well, but yeah, there you go. There's a text. In addition to those sorts of infrastructural issues, though, there's a sort of set of core data assumptions which are equally important. Those are, first, that an expressive grammar of textual analysis can allow other people to create tools that are going to benefit humanists, even those who are not themselves engaging in sort of down in the grass coding. The second is that metadata alone can be conceived as a format for encompassing most of the kinds of textual analysis that people are doing in the humanities today. And that's a philosophical component, but it also is a legal component, because it means that we can actually present these sorts of information about in-copyright text, which is a major, major issue that prevents all sorts of sharing of results. Even what we conceive of as textual content should be reconceived of just as more metadata, the number of times a book uses a particular word. And finally, that comparisons across two sets is the most important element of anything, that abstract word counts seem relatively opaque and sort of mute before us, but by making comparisons across sets, you can quickly turn those into very powerful statements. So just to sort of run through these things, this is in some ways as much for myself as for you guys, so I'm going to skip to the fun stuff. But part one here is that you want a statement which can create a corpus, that you can limit to a particular country, a particular set of years, a particular word, and compare that to something else. Part two is that you're going to define what it means to do a text grouping and to do a tokenization. I was thinking about this in Anapum's talk a lot, because a lot of what you're talking about is the failure of sort of regular forms of tokenization, which are used in many libraries to capture the variant forms of spelling. We don't necessarily want to always have L-U-E be something that shows up, but you do want to have tokenization be flexible so you can interrogate through stems, through lemmas, through lowercase and uppercase, rather than the sort of one-size-fits-all with most search engines give. You also want to be able to define what the texts are that you're actually searching in. So I actually don't end up using these heat maps most of the time when I do these things. I end up looking instead at, or I end up looking instead mostly at heat maps, which allow you to do multidimensional views across different things to see that it is in psychology that concentrating attention is most widely used in some particular period of time. This also lets you get at things like library composition to see the ways that different libraries fall out of our corpus. The thing we don't know about Google, we can know about this, that all of the British libraries disappear in 1900. Most of the other libraries disappear in 1922, although a few persist past it. Finally, the third element of the sort of grammar of textual analysis, you want to be able to create statistics summarizing across those collections of text and tokens that you've identified. So some of these are very simple statistics, like the percentage of text or the uses per million words of a particular token type, but they can get more esoteric. The average length of books in a text, things like TF-IDF and Dunning log likelihood, and possibly other kinds of calculations that can be done on top of these. Dunning log likelihood in particular is a really interesting one, because since we treat tokens as just another form of metadata, you can actually return, just as you can return grouped by the genre that something is published in, you can return grouped by tokens, and you can do things like look at what are the gender-specific words in positive reviews of history professors. Male professors who are good are most often funny. Female professors who are most often good are sweet. This is a corpus that I downloaded, about 14 million reviews of professors from ratemyprofessor.com. In negative reviews, bad male professors are jerks, bad female professors are feminist, according to the students of the United States. Yes, that is who we are teaching. And you can look at how that differs, for example, in computer science. Bad computer science female professors are not feminists, they are online, which says something that you may not know about the underlying labor conditions of computer science. And I also tend to really like these kinds of word clouds, even though they've been sort of skunked in Brian Garner's phrase as a way of representing these kinds of texts. Finally, in my last minute, I'll take a little time here, is what it means to have the practical effects of a grammar like this, what this enables. So one thing that it does is it lets us get past some of the problems with things like topic models by integrating topic models into a much larger set of metadata that's created. Too often humanists just run a topic model, sometimes link it to years and sort of like declare victory. This is not quite the right way that we should be doing it. But we can use something like a topic model and look at the way that individual tokens are distributed across topics. We can do things like take the movie corpus that I made and define a comparison which looks at what is the difference between Seinfeld and Cheers. Obviously, Seinfeld is in red here and Cheers is in black. But we can also look at that with topics as tokens rather than looking at it with individual texts as tokens. So because we're sort of agnostic about underlying data structures, you can do topic comparisons through Dunning log likelihood. So it turns out that Seinfeld in red here, once again, uses a New York topic. Cheers has a magic topic, which happens a lot. They have that old sort of 80s sitcom trope occurring in them. And you can search for trends like this. And this is since it's a flexible grammar, since it's just defined down in this little box right here, it's something that you can reconstruct for any set of corpora that has a Bookworm browser enabled on top of it. So even if you have a library that doesn't feel like implementing Dunning log likelihood on its own, it's something that can be easily done on its own. I will skip Deadwood and the Wire. It's just an incredibly profane set of slides. The last thing that I want to show is the way that this enables geographic representations. This was ostensibly supposed to be a panel about geography. So the way that we deal with geography is to take exactly the same formats that are input in or is just to reconceive of the output of a standard natural language processing thing as new metadata about the places that a document is listed, or to take information that we already have about metadata, like the publication locations of a newspaper, and turn that into information about the places that something was published. So we can make a map, much like the Center for the American West one, of what it looks like, of where the newspapers in the Chronicling America corpus are published. We can put them into time as well by adding just a little aesthetic consideration for time. And instead of having that one, we can look at how this is animated over time, with each of these corresponding to the absolute number of words that show up in the Chronicling America corpus. But we can also combine this with things like limiting to words that are about flu or influenza, publishing it at the daily level only during the period of the Spanish flu epidemic, and describe, instead of, oh, am I hitting my own server too much? Oh well, I've gone through life long enough without having a live demonstration fail. This one is amazing. We can even combine that with other sorts of outputs. Like my colleagues Ryan Cordell and David Smith are plotting the clusters of similar newspaper articles that appear over time. This is a really interesting topic. And we're able to just drop that data into this platform and look at how one particular newspaper article is republished over a number of years, this one here. We can even look at the topics that appear in that. We can integrate this kind of results with topic models. This is my basic response to this. I just don't want anybody to ask me this question. I won't even explain what I mean by it. But don't ask me what this tells us that we're doing before. Because the key thing behind this is that it is infrastructural work. This is not necessarily going to produce research questions right away, but it does promote a lot of the same kinds of issues that people have been talking about to this point. And then I will just leave up some links to individual locations that you can look at. The Sandbox HTRC browser, the code for this particular project if you want to create your own, and some documentations about how you do that. Thanks. That's all.
For Aaron and Rob, which is, I really am interested in this idea of the epigraph as kind of an alt metric, and how can we trace influence of certain texts on certain other kinds of genres. I'm thinking in particular, Addison's Cato was enormously influential on a lot of 18th and 19th century American texts, but we know that from close reading, but it might be really interesting to find out what more distant reading can tell us about what are things we don't know that it might have influenced. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about this idea of use of alt metrics for literary influence and how your work might start to influence to address that.
You go first, and then I will.
Okay. Well, I mean, exactly, or influence more generally, right? Like not necessarily just literary influence, but the Epigraphs Project is particularly good because there are TEI encoded corpora that we can use, although we found all these problems. And so yes, in part, and exactly, as one example of kind of an alt metric, right? Like what are other ways, now that we have these corpora, and how can we leverage things we haven't previously thought about because it would have been impossible, or at least very, very time consuming. We have a whole tradition of bibliography that is incredible work over years and decades of sorting and combining, discovering new ways of looking at things, but now that's kind of at our fingertips, and with what Ben's doing, are trying to make available for large corpora as well. What are these new metrics, right? So thinking of the epigraph, what are one of the initial tags for our group's Epigraph projects was, what can big data tell us about tiny texts? as a joke, and also just about, big data. It was a big deal. Well, it's still a big deal, I guess, but not to me. But a year ago, it was even more of a big thing that was really coming in, and so that was the way we were talking about it. And so, yeah, this is just one example. I think there are other things. That's what made us so interested in quotation and these genres. How do you now that we have like TEI encoding, what things can we grab that we previously wouldn't have thought about grabbing, and start sorting and looking for these kinds of ways that influence might be tracked in ways that were previously impossible or quite difficult.
Just to follow up on that, I think the bibliometrics movement is so entrenched in the sciences, and the tools that we have through Scopus and Web of Science and everything are fantastic for scientific fields, but they're terrible for telling us about the networks of humanities, sort of literary or non-scientific language discourse.
Yeah.
And you can talk more about that if you'd like.
100%. Yes, that's absolutely true. The reason we were looking at JSTOR in the first place is because we said we would. And then we realized, oh dear, actually this is not the best to try and track these citation networks. But I'm just going back earlier to what you were saying about epigraphs. One thing, alternative or sort of like strange ways of using epigraph to try to produce nuanced readings of text. We did things like, can you, for instance, tell the genre of a novel by who's being cited in the epigraphs, right? Like, can you use the epigraph effectively as a tag, right? And the answer is no one knows, right? That's the answer. No one knows yet, right? But that's why we're trying to do this, right? So you have interesting kinds of things like that where you can start to do.
And the problem is, that in part Web of Science, all that was focused on the sciences, but also the journal article has always been the kind of gold standard in the sciences, right? There are no monographs, whereas monographs are kind of been the gold standard for the last 40 to 50 years in the humanities. And so it's easy for them to create, so having looked at Web of Sciences for their Arts and Humanities citation index, most of those are dead ends, right? Well, first of all, it's just, but most of them are dead ends because they're monographs. Whereas if you look at the Web of Citation for a scientific journal article, it's just going to be most likely other scientific journal articles. And thus, if that was the whole goal, was to kind of track these webs of citation, which it is in the sciences,
which
or
makes
impact
sense,
factor,
right?
and these
Like
other things.
Yeah.
But it's difficult then to look at their data or JSTOR's data for the humanities because we just don't do things in the same way, and since disciplinary practices,
everything it's in PDF form, and the citations have not been. You don't have the DOIs in the citations, but
well, you do sometimes, right?
Sometimes you do.
Sometimes you do. Sometimes you don't.
The journal metadata, if you could find those in other
Right.
databases that might have, so maybe it's cross-checking the JSTOR content against.
Yeah.
To find out.
Yeah. Our hope was to automate this thing I was mentioning with seed articles and trying to trace out disciplines. The hope was actually to do this all automatedly, and then disaster, right?
I tweeted you it. It has some good
Nice.
mentioned there. So great.
We should stop writing books.
This is a question for Ben. I'm really curious. So when I was working for Google, I volunteered whatever time I could to John Horlock, Will Roth, and I'm an intern viewer. And like I said, whatever time I could, because it's not a money-making thing.
Yeah.
So, but what was really interesting is I sat down and I was like, well, what can we do? And one of the real problems with what we could do is permissibility. I'm really curious about how you overcame that, because he kind of laid out this, and I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with this remarkable circumstance of the court case that Google confronted with the Authors Guild. And the initial settlement was this remarkable thing. It would have made my grandmother and mother librarian extremely religious, is that libraries would share their books with the world. And I see that you're diving into single book. I'm wondering how you overcome that problem of copyright.
So it's sort of an open question. Basically, nobody who is not a member of the Authors Guild thinks that unigram and bigram counts are not permissible to share. Google itself has been incredibly scared after the lawsuit really kind of shut down its progress on this sort of work. I don't think Google is any more, back when they released the Ngram viewer, that was sort of the end of a period of 2005 to 2010 of sort of Google idealism. And it seems like Sergey's gotten interested in something else, and that's what determines the fate of all of our disciplines, is where that eye goes. But also Hati has been more, has pushed harder with the lawsuits in some ways than Google has. And Google has also turned away from its sort of greatest utopian aspiration. So like the collapse of the Google newspaper project is like the biggest evidence that Google is just not going to keep putting new digital sources out there in the next decade the way that it did in the last decade, or at least of the sort of low economic value sort of stuff that we're looking at. But there is the organization that I put the most hope in is JSTOR, because JSTOR has released the through 5 gram counts of all of the things in its libraries. And Mellon is a funder that's interested in sort of pushing this grant forward. And Mellon is sort of it's not that much better to rely on what Don Waters is interested in than in what Sergey is interested in, but like Don Waters at least has the interests of the scholarly community at heart. So I think that that's going to give us this space to promote, certainly not like arbitrary length string searches, although Hati says that they're interested in even trying to do that, which God bless them if they do it.
We're about out of time. Oh, sorry.
I just had one, the risk of sounding like an administrator, but I'm curious, and you brought up funding. So somebody mentioned that you were working with a 1K micro grant, is that right?
Yeah.
So
That's what we get from our partner.
No, but as somebody who gives out money, I'm kind of curious at the scale of what somebody can do something with effectively. $1,000 always strikes me as, I guess that's student help to do something, and then as you've discovered, it's actually more work than just doing it yourself often. No aspersions on any students but that's true. So I am kind of curious at what scale can you do something that you couldn't have done before? Maybe that's too broad a question.
Is this to us or to Ben or to?
No,
You
all work in the area and try to get funding, and not always, you don't always get $1 million to do something huge and hire a suite of programmers at contract, right? So I'm just kind of curious. So anybody can answer.
I can, why don't you go on?
Well, I can speak to the project that we're building. We didn't write a grant for it because we wanted to get the concept off the ground, but as a postdoc, my time is kind of paid for, and I just had to convince 2 or 3 other people in the Digital Humanities lab to do that. But what we're going to do probably is to use what we already have as a proof of concept and apply for a grant. But one thing I would say is I haven't bothered with asking for those kinds of micro grants the department makes available, because the students I can hire, unless it's some sort of like text markup or text encoding stuff, it's not often worth the time to expect the kind of skills they would have, or you spend most of the time training them and then they're gone in 15 weeks or so.
So our project is sort of complicated, but a lot of stuff can just be done for free, like as long as it doesn't require any employees at all. And I could just write the code for this stuff and continue developing it in the absence of sort of gaps in the funding. But the thing that keeps it going in the long term is that it shows that it's useful to wider projects. So the big thing that's going to fund my time on this and the time of the programmer down at Rice and several people at Illinois is this NEH grant, where we had a sort of prototype up and then we went to get that, and that funded it going forward. The other place that, for particularly a project like this, which is something that I've tried to learn from other kind of open source public collections projects, is that some of the work you can get done on other grants. If you can find, for instance, the Medical Heritage Library one that's being put together is in a Medical Heritage Library grant that had some indeterminate amount of money for visualization, because people have been putting visualization and new discovery methods into their grants. We have something that can fund that. I have an undergrad student of mine who I sent over there to work on it, and that allows us to feed a little bit back some improvements into the code base to keep it working on a wider variety of things.
Wait, could I speak to that actually a little bit too? Because what was interesting to me about your project was how a great many of the problems, not all of them, but were with the data in a way. With the fact that the TEI, it doesn't surprise me at all that people encode TEI documents differently. But I've heard from a number of different projects, and I've had some experience in this myself, that so much of the work is when you're working with your own corpora, right? Like that so much of the work is about cleaning up the data, rationalizing the data, standardizing the data. And I think I'm right in saying that a lot of projects wind up if they have any kind of grant funding or institutional sustainability at all, they wind up having that be what the students do, because the students presumably have some kind of subject specialty where they can learn a little TI or whatever and rationalize the data. I'm thinking of like Martin Mueller students at Northwestern and things like that, where they're really looking at the data and cleaning that up for then future processing. And then that can be, sometimes people do that, I feel like, in a classroom situation, even as opposed to like a work study situation. The term student sourcing came up the other day as an alternative to crowdsourcing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of desire to do that kind of thing, but yeah.
Well, part of what's going on in NYU is kind of a moribund institutional training culture. It's hard to get people together in the city, and there's a lot of different things going on administratively. And so that's the reason the department's giving us money to kind of just work on our own thing, train ourselves to do what we want to do.
Well, and to create a community,
yeah.
right? I mean, like to go to your question earlier about like, what do you do with $1,000? Well, not much.
Yeah.
But what you can do is like engender community of a particular set of skills, and that's huge because that's what we've been struggling like to do, right? Is like we have these interests. We know that it takes a community to do this. It's not just any one person. But.
Yeah. So $1,000 is to buy sushi, beer, and panda cookies, and get people in a room together.
I'm a big believer in that. Yes,
Yeah. Communities building cheap sushi, beer, and in a sense, like just realizing that's part of, if you're in an institutional culture like that, it's going to have to be from the ground up. We know this. We know that there's no one in upper administration NYU that's going to be pouring money in anytime soon. So what little bit you can get, you start working on, and hopefully maybe this eventually turns into us working together to write a grant of some sort, and then that
Become something we can do.
Well, I think we're over time, so if we could thank our panelists.